Tonight, we journey into the shadows, unraveling stories of terrifying encounters with entities from realms beyond. If you think you're brave enough, join us as we delve into accounts that defy logic and chill the soul. But beware! Each tale serves as a haunting reminder that some doors should remain closed. Title: Shadows of Cerritos. It was past midnight when Ethan's sedan ambled along the sleepy streets of Cerritos, its headlights slicing through the thick blanket of darkness. The concert had been exhilarating, loud, chaotic, and exactly the kind of escape the group had craved after a grueling week. Ethan gripped the wheel, his fingers tapping along to a faint beat in his head. Beside him, Claire leaned against the window, her face illuminated by the cool glow of her phone. In the back seat, Jake and Madison were animated, their laughter rising and falling as they recounted snippets of the night. A mosh pit mishap, the lead singer's antics, and the overpriced nachos that had still been worth every cent. "You think they'll play in Cerritos again?" Jake asked, slumping back against the seat. "Doubt it," Madison replied. "Did you see how small the venue was? But hey, maybe next time, L.A. Ethan smirked. L.A. sounds great, as long as I'm not the one driving through that traffic." The light-hearted banter filled the car, a warm contrast to the chill outside. But Claire was quiet, more so than usual. Her fingers traced idle patterns on the fogged-up glass of the passenger window. Ethan noticed but decided against pushing her. Claire often retreated into her own thoughts after big nights out. They approached a familiar stretch of road. On one side was a small strip of houses, their windows darkened and still. On the other loomed the outline of an elementary school. The streetlights flickered faintly, casting long, jagged shadows over the chain-link fence and deserted playground. "Man, this place gives me the creeps," Jake said, his voice taking on a teasing edge. "Imagine being a janitor here at night." Madison shuddered dramatically. "No thanks. Playgrounds are only fun when you're a kid. After dark, they're just wrong." "Would you stop?" Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "It's a school, not some haunted. Stop the car." Claire's sudden scream sliced through the air like a knife. Ethan slammed on the brakes, the car jerking violently before coming to a halt. The laughter and chatter evaporated, leaving behind an oppressive silence. "What the hell, Claire?" Jake blurted, his voice tinged with annoyance. Claire didn't respond. Her body was rigid, her hands gripping the sides of her seat as if bracing for impact. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the playground just beyond the fence. "Claire?" Ethan's voice softened, his concern overtaking his irritation. He followed her gaze but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The swings swayed slightly in the breeze. The slide glinted faintly in the moonlight. Madison leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "Claire, what's wrong? Did you see something?" For a moment it seemed as though Claire would speak. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Instead, she tore her eyes away from the window and buried her face in her hands. "Just drive," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, Ethan, just drive." Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He hit the gas, the tires crunching against the gravel as the car sped away from the school. The atmosphere in the car was heavy, the tension almost tangible. Jake, never one to handle unease in silence, attempted to break it. "So, what was that about?" he asked, his tone casual but probing. "You see a raccoon or something?" Madison shot him a glare. "Jake, not now." Ethan glanced at Claire, who sat motionless, her gaze fixed on her lap. She refused to speak, refused to look at any of them. The group's earlier levity had vanished, replaced by an unspoken fear they couldn't quite articulate. The drive back to Claire's house felt longer than usual. When they finally pulled into her driveway, she was out of the car before anyone could say a word. The sound of her door slamming echoed into the night. "She okay?" Madison asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. I'll check on her tomorrow." The next morning, Ethan sat across from Claire in the small kitchen of her family's home. She was pale, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee she hadn't touched. "What happened last night?" Ethan asked gently. Claire hesitated, her eyes darting to the window. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible. "I saw people." "People?" "On the playground." She swallowed hard. "They were covered in blood, Ethan. Just walking around like they didn't know where they were. It was like they didn't even realize." She trailed off, and Ethan waited, giving her space to find the words. "They weren't normal," she finally whispered. "There was something off about them, like they weren't really there." Ethan frowned. "Claire, it was late. We were all tired." "I know what I saw," she snapped, her voice suddenly sharp. "Don't do that, Ethan. Don't dismiss me." "I'm not," he said quickly, raising his hands in surrender. I don't know. Maybe it was a trick of the light or—" Claire shook her head. "You don't believe me. It's not that. Ethan sighed. "I'll look into it, okay? Maybe there's some kind of explanation." Ethan spent the next few hours researching the school, poring over local history websites and newspaper archives. It didn't take long for him to find it. A plane crash in 1986. The articles painted a grim picture. A commercial jet, crippled by engine failure, had plummeted into the school during the middle of the day. The death toll was staggering. Students, teachers, and passengers, their lives snuffed out in an instant. The tragedy had left the community reeling, and though the school had been rebuilt, the scars lingered. Ethan's stomach churned as he scrolled through the photos. Charred playground equipment, crumpled fuselage, and the faces of grieving families. He closed his laptop, his hands trembling. When he called Claire to share what he had found, her response was immediate. "I knew it," she said, her voice laced with both fear and vindication. "I wasn't imagining it." Ethan didn't have the heart to tell her he still wasn't sure if he believed in ghosts. But one thing was certain. Something had happened that night, and whatever it was, it had left its mark. Ethan couldn't shake the encounter at the school. Though the rational part of his mind dismissed it as a mix of exhaustion and suggestion, another part, a deeper, nagging part, demanded answers. Claire's story, coupled with the tragic history of the plane crash, refused to let him rest. Over breakfast the following day, he found himself scrolling through old newspaper clippings again. His search unearthed witness accounts, testimonies from grieving families, and grim details about the recovery efforts. He lingered over a photo of the ruined playground, now eerily similar to how it had looked that night, desolate and haunting. By mid-afternoon, Ethan called Jake and Madison over to share what he'd found. "So," Jake said, leaning back on the couch, "you're saying Claire wasn't just seeing things?" "I'm saying there's more to this than we thought," Ethan replied, tapping the laptop screen. Madison leaned forward, scrolling through the articles. "Look at this," she murmured, pointing at an old news report. "They say the crash site wasn't properly cleared for years. Some families didn't even get closure. Bodies were never found." Jake whistled low. "That's dark. But what are you thinking? That their spirits are just hanging out?" Ethan shook his head. "Not spirits, but maybe memories, leftover imprints of the crash. Something unresolved." Madison sat back, arms crossed. "There's only one way to know for sure," Jake groaned. "Please don't say we're going back there." Madison shot him a determined look. "We are." They planned their return carefully. Unlike their previous visit, this time they would be prepared. Madison brought a flashlight and a notebook. Jake, reluctantly, carried a camera. Ethan, ever the pragmatist, packed a small first aid kit and some snacks, just in case. When Claire learned of their plan, her reaction was swift and vehement. "You can't," she said, her voice trembling. "It's not safe." "We'll be fine," Ethan reassured her. "You don't understand." Her eyes were wide, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "It's not just visions. There's something wrong there, something bad." Her warning hung in the air as they left, an unsettling weight they couldn't shake. They arrived at the school just after midnight, parking a few blocks away to avoid drawing attention. The air was cold and still, the kind of quiet that seemed unnatural. The playground loomed ahead, its equipment casting jagged shadows under the pale moonlight. "You sure about this?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with unease. "No," Ethan admitted. "But we're here." Madison clicked on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. They climbed the chain-link fence, landing softly on the other side. For a while, everything was silent. They walked the perimeter of the playground, scanning for anything unusual. Madison jotted notes while Jake snapped photos, though his hands were unsteady. "It's just a school," Jake muttered. "Nothing's happening." Ethan wasn't so sure. There was a tension in the air, a weight that pressed against his chest. And then they heard it, a faint, rhythmic creaking. All three turned toward the swings. One of the swings was moving, not gently, as if stirred by the wind, but violently, as though someone or something was pushing it. "There's no wind," Madison whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan stepped closer, his breath visible in the cold air. He reached out to steady the swing, but the moment his fingers touched the chain, it stilled. "Let's go," Jake said, backing away. "This isn't funny anymore." But before they could move, a sharp, metallic screech filled the air. They turned toward the slide, where a shadow moved swift and deliberate. "Did you see that?" Madison hissed, clutching Ethan's arm. "I saw it," he replied, his voice tight. The shadow disappeared into the darkness, but the air seemed to grow colder. Suddenly, there was a loud clang, like metal striking metal. Then another, and another. "Where's it coming from?" Jake asked, his camera trembling in his hands. Ethan scanned the playground. "I don't know." And then he saw them. Figures. Faint and flickering like images projected onto a screen. They moved aimlessly, their forms blurred but unmistakable. Some stumbled, others crawled, their movements erratic and disjointed. One turned its head, as though sensing their presence. Ethan grabbed Madison and Jake. "We're leaving. Now." They ran, vaulting the fence and sprinting back to the car. Once inside, they locked the doors, their breaths ragged and uneven. "What the hell was that?" Jake demanded. Ethan didn't answer. His hands were gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Madison stared out the window, her face pale. "It wasn't just us," she said quietly. "Other people have seen it. Claire saw it. It's real." The drive back was silent. No one spoke, each lost in their thoughts. Ethan dropped Jake and Madison off before heading home. But sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the figures, their hollow gazes and jerky movements. He knew they hadn't imagined it. But if it wasn't imagination, then what was it? The next day, Ethan dove deeper into his research. He found forums and blogs, accounts from people who had seen or heard things near the school. One post, in particular, caught his attention. "They're not ghosts. They're echoes, fragments of what happened. And they won't stop until someone listens." Ethan's stomach churned. If that was true, then the figures weren't just a manifestation of the crash. They were tied to something unresolved. But how could they help? He decided to visit Claire. If anyone had answers, it would be her. Claire was reluctant to talk at first. But when Ethan told her what they'd seen, her resolve crumbled. "It's the crash," she said finally. "The pain, the confusion. It's still there. It's like it's trapped." "How do we stop it?" Ethan asked. Claire shook her head. "I don't know if we can, but we can try." "What do you mean?" "There's a memorial," she said, "for the victims. People leave flowers and notes. Maybe if we go there, we can figure out what they need." Ethan wasn't sure if it would work, but he knew they had to try. The days following their haunting experience were a blur. Ethan, Madison, Jake, and Claire each struggled to make sense of what had happened. The encounter at the playground left them shaken but also determined to find closure. Not just for themselves, but for the lingering souls tied to the school's tragic history. Ethan poured himself into research, uncovering every detail about the crash. Newspaper articles, personal accounts, even government investigation reports became his constant companions. His nights were sleepless, his thoughts consumed by what they'd seen. One evening, as he sifted through an old journal entry from a teacher who survived the crash, a detail stood out. The children who didn't make it, they deserved better. The memorial is beautiful, but it doesn't feel complete. So much pain lingers here, and I don't know if it will ever fade. It was a simple observation, but it struck Ethan deeply. The memorial at the playground had been erected quickly, more as a gesture to appease the public than to honor the victims. Perhaps that was the key. When he called the others, they agreed to meet. "We need to do something," Ethan said firmly. "The memorial isn't enough. We have to find a way to truly honor them." Madison nodded. "But how? What can we do that hasn't already been done?" Jake frowned. "What if it's not just about the memorial? What if it's about remembering them, actually acknowledging who they were?" Claire hesitated. "It's not just about what we do," she said softly. "It's about them. We need to listen to what they're trying to tell us." The group decided to revisit the archives, this time focusing on the victims. They collected names, photos, and stories, piecing together fragments of lives that had been abruptly ended. Claire, despite her apprehension, reached out to families of the victims. Some were hesitant to talk, the pain still raw even decades later. Others welcomed the opportunity, sharing cherished memories of loved ones lost. One conversation stood out. An elderly woman named Mrs. Green, who had lost her grandson in the crash, shared a heartbreaking story. "He loved the swings," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "Every day after school, he'd run straight to the playground. That was his favorite spot." Claire listened intently, her heart heavy. She couldn't help but think of the swing they'd seen moving that night. As the group compiled the stories, they began to notice patterns. Many of the children had specific attachments to the playground: a slide, a sandbox, a favorite bench. These details painted a vivid picture of the lives that had once filled the space with laughter and joy. With this newfound understanding, the group devised a plan. They would hold a remembrance ceremony, inviting the community to come together and honor the victims properly. Ethan worked tirelessly to organize the event, securing permission from the school and spreading the word. Madison designed posters and created a digital memorial to accompany the ceremony. Jake, though reluctant at first, took charge of logistics, ensuring everything was in place for the event. Claire, meanwhile, faced her fears head-on. She returned to the playground during daylight hours, leaving small tokens: a stuffed animal, a ribbon, a handwritten note. At spots she felt drawn to. Each visit was an emotional ordeal, but she felt a growing sense of connection. It was as if the playground was coming alive again, not with fear, but with memory and meaning. The night of the ceremony was cold but clear. Candles lined the edges of the playground, their flickering light casting a warm glow over the somber setting. Families of the victims, neighbors, and even strangers gathered, their faces reflecting a mix of grief and hope. Ethan stood before the crowd, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Tonight, we come together to remember those we lost, to honor their lives, their laughter, and the joy they brought to this world. This playground was theirs, and tonight we give it back to them." As the ceremony unfolded, people shared stories and memories. Mrs. Green spoke about her grandson, her voice trembling but resolute. Others followed, their words weaving a tapestry of lives that had touched so many. Claire lit a single candle at the center of the playground. "This is for those who can't speak for themselves," she said softly. "We hear you. We remember you." The moment was quiet but powerful. A gentle breeze swept through the crowd, rustling the leaves and causing the candles to flicker. And then it happened. Faint figures began to appear, barely visible in the dim light. They moved slowly, their forms indistinct but unmistakable. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the figures gathered near the playground equipment. They weren't frightening or menacing. Instead, they seemed peaceful. One by one, the figures turned toward the crowd. For a brief moment, the air felt charged with emotion: grief, relief, gratitude. Then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone. The crowd stood in stunned silence. "They're at peace," Claire whispered, tears streaming down her face. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, his own eyes glistening. "We did it." In the weeks that followed, the playground became a symbol of hope and remembrance. The community rallied to maintain it, ensuring it remained a place of joy for future generations. For Ethan, Madison, Jake, and Claire, the experience left an indelible mark. They had faced something inexplicable and come out stronger, bound by a shared purpose. Though they never saw the figures again, they felt their presence in small, subtle ways. A swing swaying gently in the breeze, the faint sound of laughter on a quiet night. And they knew, without a doubt, that the souls tied to the playground had finally found peace.